So what we're going to do right now, I'm going to start out with a little clip. This is all going to be spliced together. This is at the end of reading Kerry Bolton's Zionism, Islam in the West. So we're going to play this little clip here at the end where I start to give a rebuttal. Kerry Bolton brings up and tries to syncretize. He tries to bring together Julius Evola, who is an esotericist from the pagan tradition, and Islam and right-wing Christianity, with Islam as the solution. But he brings this up as the solution for all the esotericism and corruption that is in Zionism and blames all Marxism on it. But at other points he admits the dialecticians and the Fabians that Dyer talks about. But then he brings in all this other esoteric shit that will lead to the same place, and it leads to syncretism. And the Orthodox view against ecumenism would see this as leading us towards a type of antichrist religion. This would just be the right-wing response that's doomed to synthesis into something false, even though we would be probably considered on the right as more conservative. So I'm going to play this clip here. So this is a clip of Jay Dyer refuting Julius of Evola in his Eyes Wide Shut analysis. For some reason it's got night vision on it when I recorded it on my phone, but I think I'll be able to fix that when I put this back up.
Abandon. In the practice of sex magic, the goal of erasing oppositions is believed to be effected in the sexual act. Traditionalist philosopher Julius Evola echoes Pike's original comments at the beginning of this.
Pike is the Freemason who wrote Morals and Dogma, which is basically the Bible of the Freemasons. And he believes in an immanentized God based on the natural laws in the world. So you end up in a dialectic and you need to act this out, and you end up in religious phenomenology. That's always these archetypal opposites and dyads. And it ends in the same place as Evola. Evola ends up in a very, very similar place, and it's sex magic, orgies. That's prone to human corruption. And it's a lot like in Romans 1:24, when they forsake the real God, then they end up in their own hedonism and acting out homosexuality, lesbianism, orgies, kind of stuff we see in the Old Testament. And we're seeing it rampant today. So you want to solve this problem, and Kerry Bolton wants to talk about sorcery, but then you end up in the same place again here with Evola you're advocating. And you don't really care about what the religion is. It's just a sociological reduction to make it right-wing. But you're just the opposite of what the fuck they're doing on the left.
Chapter, and explains that the attempt to overcome dualities and the affecting of the psychosphere through such actions is the purpose of this occult working. Sexes is a special method of manifestation of the dyad principle, which also conditions the division between spiritual and nature, ego and non-ego. If there exists a metaphysical coincidence, as we have seen, as John Scotus Erigena recognized it, then there may well be a relationship between the experience of transcendence through sex and a non-dual state that permits a direct extranormal action on the non-ego.
So they think this action is going to actually lead to something in reality and give them something special. And even ones that don't actually really believe this find it useful for blackmailing purposes. And you want to talk about the Kabbalism and the sorcery of the Jews and the Zionists, and here it is in the pagans. And you arrive at similar structures. You arrive in similar structures in the Chinese alchemy and the places where they allow pedophilia to this day. So you haven't quite solved this problem. And then when you see this stuff in Rosicrucianism, before the Jews had power, you can't quite blame it all on them. Nor same with the Italian merchant class that got into all this stuff. It's a structure that the Gnostic impulse seeks. It seeks hermetic structures, and then they're supposed to actually do something. And you keep ending up, there's only so many working presuppositions you can have. So you still end up in this kind of Hegelian type of dialectics, and these right-wing MAGA Marxists are based on that type of metaphysics. So they're still out of the same problem. They haven't fixed it just because they went for Stalinism. And that's where this stuff's going. It's even left to fascism right now and moved into that sphere. Then you get esoteric Islam. Rumi ends up having verses about pedophilia, just like Muhammad Hijab advocates from a more action-oriented and masculine type of angle. You see it with bestiality in Rumi. You see the bestiality that the Romans had. They used to have bestiality on display where they would have women raped by giraffes and other animals. And Uberboyle was crushed in debate with David Patrick Harry from Church of the Eternal Logos on that point. So we keep arriving at these same issues. You know, that's important too, because that's where a lot of these guys always end up going, whether they're coming from Islam or they're coming from the Black Pill and the Nietzschean pagans, who people like Dugan will also tell us we're supposed to ally with to stop the evil Satan, as though there's only one. Is that we're all a bunch of weak people that came out of a Jewish psyop. Then another minute they talk out the other side of their face because they are liars. That, you know, Islam can be our ally and we could all get along together. But it's very clear where they come from. And that kind of rebuttal of that old 19th century history, especially from the Orthodox standpoint and from Byzantium and all this, and the fact that we are not pacifists, even though there might be times when that's the only route or recourse somebody has, or a spiritual father who's very holy takes that route of martyrdom, it really rebuts the point that Christianity was just a weak thing that couldn't hold anything together or keep a civilization together. I would say it does it better than anything else that's been tried. The problem is that man has free will and can reject it. Same places. I mean, Commodus, when he was emperor, his wife had a competition for how many men she could sleep with the empire's biggest prostitute, and some insane number of men in one day. So you keep ending up in the same degeneracy, and we keep seeing it on display, but you act like it's just a red herring and it's only the Jews. Well, it's everything that is outside of Christianity, especially since Christ came. And it's always the way these things have to come together in opposition to it, especially as modernity happens and you start having religious syncretism and everything is subject to the economic and technical structure. I mean, that's Marxism is an update of that Gnosticism. So is the transhumanism.
Of the outer web of events. Let us recall that this is the classical Platonic version of the myth of the original hermaphrodite, and of a power such that it struck fear into the gods and was attributed to that before being split. So in other words, here is Evola saying that sexual magic is just ancient pagan psychodrama repackaged. But in many ways, it's important to understand this is actually how these cults view their actions. The cults believe that these things are real and that they really do have an effect. So while most people may not understand the world this way due to modern rationalism and scientism, many pagans and occultists do understand the world this way. In regards to the movie's ritual scene, in regards to the magic circle, Evola also writes, here it is a matter of the chakra, or the chains or wheels consisting of couples who perform ritual coitus together in circular formation. The middle of the circle is the lord of the wheel, together with his companions who officiate and direct this collective operation. An adept who has had perfect initiation is needed to perform this function. Overall, this is a collective and partly orgiastic evocation of the goddess, the latent force within the group, a force.
And you see this stuff in their Dionysian rites back with the ancient Greeks without any Jews present. And you see it happen with the androgyny and the cross-dressing there. You see it happen with the kind of hermaphroditic ideas that are sometimes in Plato. Plato had advocacy for what he called right pederasty, because if you allowed pederasty with any age, people thought it was evil. He thought if you didn't allow it all, that was bad, and you needed this gnosis of eros and beauty and the youth to move you towards like connection to the forms. And Herbert Marcuse draws from that and says that's the most important part in Plato. And he actually advocates for this in Eros and Civilization, especially you have to get the original edition in print because Kindle removes this part, saying this is the most important part and it should be used to break down the family. So I don't exactly know what you're gonna do, why you're bringing Evola in here, and it's because you're looking at the traditions of all cultures for a militant version of it to blend the paganism with the Abrahamic religions, as though you can make a Chrislam type of syncretism and get everybody on board with this. But it's subordinate to these abstract ideas that will always end up in esoteric phenomenology if you try to make any sense out of them and justify them or engage with them. And it's quite obviously there with a lot of the homosexuality that went on behind the scenes with the Nazi Party. So you're not actually solving the problem. It's really a ridiculous point here to bring this guy in, and a lot of the contradictory points he made in here. And Islam too, you can see where somebody, I think, like Henri Corbin, will also go to the Valkyrie, or he calls it the Walkürja from the German version, to go back to the Frivertes and the Diana and Zoroastrianism to try to re-blend these things. So you can have something like Dante's Beatrice, but a warrior version of it. And then you still end up in these pagan religious experiences, which can deceive you. St. Paul says Lucifer can appear as an angel of light, and this is the problem with Muhammad. Muhammad had a vision that his wife actually suspected was demonic, and he didn't have Christ to try the spirits. Any spirit that says they are not in the flesh, that Christ was not God in the flesh and the Son of God and cannot say his name, is a demon. You have no ability or criteria to actually test for demons because they can pretend to be angels. And we've seen the result of this, and the result of Muhammad's schism allowed the schism with the papacy, and that allowed all the esotericism to break out in the Renaissance, and that allowed the Protestant Reformation and Enlightenment, and also the Zionists, to take their claim. And Islam is part of this long-range dialectic.
Arouse the realization of acts and visualization of images by the individual pairs until a fluidic or, quote, psychic vortex is created and used in the operation. A similar method performed for the benefit of others is used in professional magic rites. Tantric chakra have been convened by princes for specific purposes, such as propitiation of success in war. So this is the whole idea behind the pagan psychodrama, and this is the worldview of the elites, according to Stanley Kubrick. I think this is correct, and I'm not promoting the works of Julius Evola. I think his critique of the modern world is very insightful and very good. But as you can see, this idea of returning to some ancient pagan psychodrama really is already the worldview of our moneyed elites and is therefore degenerate and destructive.
That's really the main point here. You're trying to stop the elites with similar views to them, and it's the same with the incorporation of Islam. It's the same with this MAGA Marxism that's obviously being pushed for an end of breaking down a true, real religious response to the elites. Right now, while that is actually possible, somebody like Hinkle is here to co-opt that and start blending in degen versions of Islam with like Sneeko, Tate, all this shit. I mean, Tate's out here making like Gnostic comics and stuff. It's absurd. Let's see if we can get this here. So when you see Hinkle here with Sneeko taking the Quran with no critique, no rebuttal, nothing. He just wants to bring it in and bring it together with allies, but he never puts up anything orthodox.
Introduction to Islam is not reading the Quran. I think the best is to learn about the Prophet's life, the Prophet Muhammad's life, peace be upon him. So this is the Prophet's biography in minutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me know how it is, because I haven't read that yet, and I am interested.
I haven't even read it. This guy is such a phony. He hasn't even read it, but here, learn about Muhammad. It's just to have this based religion and say you can have the word God the way a politician does, but now it's for an influencer. And here we have all kinds of martyrs under Islam, and we're going to get into some of them. It's just absurd. Hinkle doesn't bring up any rebuttal. He doesn't bring up our case against ecumenism. He goes on there with Candace. He goes to Candace Owens on Twitter advocating that she talk about MAGA Marxism with Has. I mean, as the leading intellectual for American communism. But he never brings up the Orthodox case. He's here to stifle our case and make sure nobody hears it. and co-opt it and bring in and infiltrate with a whole bunch of Marxism, a bunch of garbage, and to blend with Islamic syncretism, which has been a goal of the elites for a very long time.
Did afterwards. Most of what so it's extremely important in Islam to learn about the life of Muhammad. I find this the most interesting.
Because he's a phony. If we look at his guys that he sends out, he won't do it. He'll avoid Dyer on the Crucible, but we can look at, here's some of his followers. About the new martyrs. We have tons of new martyrs under communism. This is Hinkle's following. They were enemies of communism. They were enemies of the people. They'll share things such as icons of Stalin to show us that that the church was in line with Stalinism, that Stalin was some kind of an Orthodox saint. But the thing is, there we go. This is part of Stalin's Sergian Church. And the Sergian Church was propped up after the Catacombs Church and after the Renovationist Church. The Renovationist, or the Living Church, was a bunch of people trying to innovate and subject orthodoxy to the world with academic ideas. And the communists actually targeted this church to weaken orthodoxy because they saw it as the number one enemy to communism, just like our government is spying on the Orthodox Church and traditional Christians and trying to change the religions because it's an enemy to globalism. They're not doing anything like that with this Has and Hinkle movement. I think they're actually letting it blow up on purpose for a controlled dialectic. So Stalin, when this Renovationist church was so rejected by the populace, he put up something that was closer to being partly Orthodox but still subject to communism. It was a false church and it was still rejected. The communists were anathematized by our actual saints. And when he allowed the real church to coexist with the Sergian Church, he just looked at the people who wouldn't go to his fake church, and then he persecuted the ones who went to the real one. This is exactly the playbook that's going on with Zelensky. He puts up the fake church from the West that tries to subject the real church to Western values. The people that will not go to this Coomer church get thrown in jail. They get depersoned. He drafted like a 67-year-old bishop from the real church into the army in the middle of this war. So it's the same tactic. And you know who actually upheld Stalin's church, by the way? The same people that upheld Stalin's church and gave autocephaly to Zelensky's church are the same people that put the blessing on Stalin's fake church, the Sergian Church. Sergius was a renovationist. So let's take a step back, because these people talk Jew this, Jew that. Let's take a look at the Renovationist Church. Here it is. This is the man that headed that church right here, Alexander Vedensky, leader of the Living Church. He was a major infiltrator. He wanted to put it into the hands of natural theology and perennialist ideas and make the church into a social tool that would work for the world and bring about peace. These same types of ideas, whether they take the right-wing type of that idea with Kerry Bolton, whether you have Hinkle, Lucas Gage will go out saying that the religions are basically the same and you need to stop the only one evil in the world, which is the Jews. This isn't an excuse for Zionism. I'm very critical of it. But here's your thing. Some of these guys will run around calling us Jews and Jew lovers and talk about how base this church was. Well, the one that got the communists in, even though Stalin would later be anti-Zionist, this Vedensky was a Jew that had converted. His family was Jewish. And he comes in just like he's part of all these clubs. He was in the salons and everything where all these ideas went around, whether they came from a Protestant like Adam Weishaupt, whether it's Lenin, whether it was the Protocols of Zion. All these ideas are exactly the same. And this is the type of religiosity this guy has. And this church was ripe for blackmail. So the people that didn't truly believe and wouldn't withstand the communists were the very same people that could be easily blackmailed. Sergius, who was part of the church that made Stalin icons, was a part of the Renovationists, and he repented, but he was like a neo-renovationist that still took these ideas and made them a little more orthodox. One of the catacombs bishops writes, "A very little time passed between September 1943 and January 1945. Therefore, it is difficult to understand where 41 bishops came from instead of 19. In this respect, our curiosity is satisfied by the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate for 1944. Looking through it, we see that 19 bishops who existed in 1943 to 1944 rapidly gave birth to the rest, who became the members of the 1945 Council. From the Journal of the Moscow Patriarchate, we learn that these hasty consecrations were carried out in the overwhelming majority of cases on Renovationist proto-priests. From September 1943 to January 1945, with a wave of a magic wand, all the Renovationists suddenly repented before Metropolitan Sergius. The penitence was simplified without the imposition of any demands on those who had done so much evil to the Holy Church, and in the shortest time the penitent Renovationists received a lofty dignity, places, and ranks in spite of the church canons and the decree about the reception of Renovationists imposed by Patriarch Tikhon in 1925. So Patriarch Tikhon is an actual saint of the church. Stalin put up this fake church with Sergius, and Sergius tried to fight from within and had his kid tortured in front of him. So it's pretty obvious why they would have made Stalin icons. And these MAGA Marxists will run around saying that they are so based and that the Russians loved communism. All this. But they're liars. And what they don't understand with this Stalinism, even though there's many people that don't want Stalin to be made to look bad, they'll sit here and say most religious people in Russia today all admire and look up to Stalin. It's only Western reactionaries like you that dishonor the history of the USSR and the legacy of the Russian people. You are scum. So people well uphold Stalin because he stopped the Nazis, and he also was anti-Zionist, and he turned communism ethno-nationalist. And some people will uphold this false church, but when I read a study on this, it's 53% want people to know about the horrors of Stalin. And your likelihood to be anti-Stalinist is much higher if you are deeply religious. So this negates this point here. The 47% that actually either support Stalin or they don't want people talking about his crimes because they don't want Russia to look bad are very similar to people who cannot admit any problems with Americanism. It's almost like a boomer mentality. It's really 23% of them, 23% of the populace there that still actually supports Stalin. The whole 47% really involves people that just don't want Russian history to be tarnished and to talk about the sins of it or have people continually like bad-mouthing and smearing and tarnishing Russia. It's 23% that are actually Stalinist supporters. And that's partly due to the propaganda. It's partly due to this young wave of guys who think it's so base to support somebody badass that will uphold order at any cost. And Putin's played both sides of that. If you look through Western propaganda, they'll only talk about him upholding Stalin to show how evil Putin is. But he actually has some nuanced takes on this, and he upholds the stopping of the Nazis and the removal of the internationalist and globalist type of communism, kind of inadvertently saving the day. But he's against communism and he condemns it. You're starting to see more people, as these Eastern European countries are turning back to orthodoxy, actually call and repudiate Joseph Stalin. So you're talking about a 23% of the populace that actually really supports Stalin, and that's not the most religious people. The more religious you are, and the more you had like saints and martyrs in your family and people that were killed and abused by this, which would have been people who were more religious, right? The more likely you are to condemn Stalinism. So that's just ridiculous. We want to get into St. Tikhon here. If you forgive me for not being, I'm just learning how to do these live streams and manage all this, and this kind of gets into that. So we see, let's get into St. Tikhon. or this is Sergius. We'll go to Sergius, and then we'll go to St. Tikhon's anathema of communism. And if you want to understand something about orthodoxy, when an anathema is accepted by everybody, it's eternal. So if a teaching was false or an enemy of the church, an enemy of Christ, theologically, even if it took humans here on earth forever and the church to figure it out, once it's figured out and accepted, it's actually eternal, and that anathema already existed in heaven because heaven is eternal. So it's a pretty big deal when somebody anathematizes something.
Now here comes the text that's been most often quoted in the yellow portion here is what's almost always quoted. Having begun with the blessing of God, our synodal work, we clearly realize the magnitude of the task that lies ahead, both for us and for all the representatives of the church in general. We need to show, not in words, but in deeds, that not only those who are indifferent to Orthodox Christianity, not only those who have betrayed it, but also its most zealous adherents, all of you, in other words, the bishops and priests that are listening to me, for whom it is dear as truth and life, with all its dogmas and traditions, with all its canonical and liturgical structure, can be faithful citizens of the Soviet Union, loyal to the Church Soviet government. We want to be Orthodox and at the same time recognize the Soviet Union as our civil motherland. Now, here's some of the additions that certainly were never said by St. Tikhon and others, whose joys and successors are our joys and successes, and whose failures are our failures. Any blow directed to the Union, now, not to the motherland, not to the people, to the Union. So it appears that he's referring to including the governing authorities, be it a war, a boycott, some kind of social disaster, or just a murder from around the corner, like the Warsaw one, is recognized by us as a blow directed at us. So any blow to the Soviet power, to the Union, to the governing authority, is a blow directed at us. So he is identifying the church with the state with the church. What's so odd here, we're going to talk about this repeatedly, I'll repeat myself because I want to drive it home. What's so odd here is that the Soviets had worked for a decade to maintain a separation of church and state and had made the church illegal. Now the Soviets, along with Metropolitan Sergius, are saying we have a union of the church and state, and we have legality, a union. So now we become a part, an apparatus, an adjunct of the state apparatus. This was not done by Patriarch Tikhon, of course. Remaining Orthodox, we remember our duty to be citizens of the Union, not only out of fear, but also by conscience. Okay, so this is another phrase that was used in the letters in rejection of his declaration, that we are of conscience to a governing authority which up until this point, including St. Tikhon, everyone had recognized as not of God, as an usurpation of legitimate authority, as a demonic, satanic authority over the people of God in Russia. So now he quotes the apostle, not only out of fear, but also by conscience, that we are dutiful citizens. We do our duty up to the state, for the state. We become united in goals and aims, joys and successes to the state. And we hope that with the help of God, with our common assistance and support, this task will be solved by us, achieved. I'm not sure, the translation is probably not so accurate there. So that's the that paragraph. Okay, that's the paragraph that is most offensive, but there's more. We're going to keep reading because, again,
so this is a major point because we do believe in duty to authorities, but not to the point where it subjugates the church into false teachings. That's why people martyred in the early church. So to have a satanic Marxism that is anti-theistic and completely evil with Leninism and Marxism, it's not compatible. Dyer also went into the history too and really trashed the Marxism and its mystical suppositions and got to the history of it coming out of Gemestos Platon, going back to Heraclitus and the ancient Greeks, and in a whole stream about it. Right after he trashed Has in a debate that these idiots actually think they won, because Has can come in and be like, J-Dyer, little bitch, sit down, boy, sit down, bitch, boy, you don't want to be a man. He staged this whole shit so he could actually avoid having a real debate, come in acting like a tough guy without anything to really debate. Then he has no epistemology and thinks he can just throw out metaphysics, which is a conversation Dyer has had over and over and over again. He's not obligated to a platform. These people are here just for activism. And if they don't like that, we don't want to be obligated to cater to their activism. They could eat shit. Shut up. Just shut up. You're a liar.
Created by the apostasy of man, by the fall of man, right? And those things that he allows because he cannot and does not want to. It's not that he can, does not want to ever to impinge upon our freedom. Unlike the Soviet power and unlike the metropolitan here who has agreed to the impinging of the freedom of the church, the Lord never wants that for anyone. And he never does that. He always he wants free human beings to freely choose to be with him, and he never imposes. And that is because he has arkodia, his nobility. The Lord is a noble philotimos, to use Elder Paisios' expression. I mean, he is. That's the spirit of God. It's not a spirit of totalitarian. But those who provoke it
here is the arguments when Sergius came out with his declaration. We have the real Orthodox people very clearly arguing with him, and that's always happened. There's always been like corrupt emperors, corrupt bishops, heretics. Arius was in the lead when he was defeated. There's always been real people that either refuted them successfully or had to go through a period of tribulation before reasserting the true faith. Sergius wasn't the one who was in the real church.
Through diversion from Orthodox ecclesiology, the first cause are creating schism. So in the 1923 change of the calendar and all these innovations that were imposed on the churches without a conciliar.
Zelensky just did this, by the way. If he is enforcing the new calendar on everybody and saying they must celebrate Christmas on December 25th. Same thing. It's kind of telling that Hinkle, who's supposed to be so based and for Russia and against the U.S. and against Zionism and against neoconservatism, doesn't bring up these facts and go deeper into the Orthodox case or platform any Orthodox people that would completely devastate these idiots. The same way, just like a fraction of it with Tucker Carlson being exposed to a little bit of the facts completely sunk Mike Pence's battleship. With this giant platform as the most viral account on X, it's just kind of, I have no idea why. Jackson Hinkle, why doesn't he bring up the real Orthodox case? I don't get it. Why doesn't, because you're not here to actually stop these people. You're here to co-opt our narrative and stop us from talking. And then you have an army of little goons attacking the saints and the new martyrs coming after Dyer to stop him from talking. They know who we are. You got Fordham and you got European left-wing rags targeting us. You got people spying on the Russian church in America. They know who we are. They know what our case is. If you go back to Quigley that Dyer's lectured on, and the case with Sutton, how they saw Russia as an enemy to modernity and internationalism, they went after this in a targeted manner. They may not agree with our theology, but they've studied it. You have entire teams of people at like Fordham with the Luch Foundation, Arcus funding all that, who sit there trying to distort and co-opt our people. You have people co-opting our saints. And then you have people doing it, I think, on their own as well, who are part of perennialist projects and want some of what we have and the sophistication to deal with the walls they're running into when you're seeing, like with Vervaeke talking with Bishop Maximus Murata. So that's the more center-left version of what these MAGA Marxists are trying to do, or what you see Lucas Gage doing when he says Islam and Christianity are the same. Well, Islam, with its massive apostasy rates, is going to bleed into that. But we don't believe the same. And you see these same tactics and some history here. You could flesh this history out, even if you don't go all the way in depth in it all the time. Well, he wants to play that game, but then upload has as though he's this big intellectual to have intellectual discussion. But then goalpost move to what's effective in short form. You could condense some of this to short form too. He's more interested in having this pro-Palestinian MAGA Marxism as part of this dialectical game that's going on.
About a pan-Orthodox decision, this departure from Orthodox ecclesiology at the heart of why the calendar change was an error. The calendar change was an error, not because so much, although that's another discussion, but first and foremost, it was an error because of the denial of Orthodox ecclesiology. By the way, the same renovationists in Constantinople, the same mind that created that situation and departed from Orthodox ecclesiology, were in agreement with the renovationists of Russia. Again, Metropolitan Sergius was one of them at one point, and they also, paradoxically, supposedly for democratic institutions in the church, are papalists and do not follow the Orthodox ecclesiology in this area. So, truth is not always where the majority is, remarked Archpriest Dobroravov. Otherwise, the Savior would not have spoken of the little flock. And the head of the church has not always turned out to be on the side of the truth. How true that is. We have many, many heretics who were patriarchs of Constantinople and patriarchs of other sees. It is sufficient to recall the time of Maximus the Confessor. Indeed. The dialogue is almost coming to an end. We go on. By my new church policy, I am saving the church. You're going to hear this now many times afterwards by other people, including some in our own day. Metropolitan Sergius replied deliberately. And they all screamed at this point. Unbelievable that we heard such a phrase. What are you saying, Vladika? The church does not have need of salvation. The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. You yourself, Vladika, have need of salvation through the church. This is true for many of us, brothers and sisters. Do not look only at the.
And this is here what these people will say. You don't have influence. We need to solve the JQ. You need to hurry up and get on board with this. We got to have the Islam here. Gage will make this point. All that's necessary is that we come together to save everything. Well, the most important thing to save is actual eternal verities and truth given to us in the church, and we're not going to apostatize for that. To actually make peace and pretend you're going to solve things worldly while rejecting the truth is actually this path to an alternative to Christ, anything that is above and in place of him. This is the entire Antichrist thing. The gates of hell will not prevail against the church, even when it's diminished and there's few Christians in the end times. So these people are coming up with excuses to subject religion to their worldly aims. We're still in the world. We want things to work. We want to tell the truth and actually win and defeat this evil. But not at this cost. And here we get into that anathema I was talking about, which is an eternal ruling. So communism is an eternally anathematized, which means cursed, ideology. It's a demonic religion with demonic roots.
And what is the reaction of the church? Well, on February 1st, 1918, that's not very far into this. At the end of January, we have the separation of church and state. And so the three-month period from their taking power now, less than 3 months have passed. And St. Tikhon comes out on his own with a very strong document which we're going to read. At the time, the council was in recession to find and follow dress. He leads with a quote from Galatians, he might deliver us from this present evil world. That's probably not the King James, actually, the more I think about that. The open and concealed enemies of the truth of Christ have started to persecute that truth and are aiming a mortal blow at the cause of Christ. In place of Christian love, they are sowing seeds of malice, envy, and fratricidal war. Christ's precept to love our neighbor is forgotten and trampled underfoot, should be underfoot. Every day we learn that innocent people, not excluding those lying sick in bed, are being frightfully and brutally murdered for the sole offense they have honestly discharged their duty to the country and have devoted all their energies to serve the welfare of the people. These crimes are committed in broad daylight with unprecedented effrontery and outrageous brutality in almost every city of our native land. Now, put yourself, you're in Russia, you're in a parish. The patriarch has issued this encyclical and he's directing it to you. Think about it. Think about what you're witnessing, transformation of all daily life, perhaps even witnessing these brutal and outrageous actions on the part of this thuggery. And now St. Tikhon comes with a word to you. I go on. These crimes fill our heart with deep sorrow and compel us to denounce sharply these monsters of the human race. In accordance with the precept of the Holy Apostle, them that sin reprove in the sight of all, that the rest also may be in fear. We could use this approach of St. Tikhon quite a bit today, more often. It'd be good to see. He goes on, think what you are doing, you madmen. Stop your bloody reprisals. Your acts are not merely cruel. They are the works of Satan, for which you will burn in hellfire in the life hereafter, and be cursed by future generations in this life. By the authority given me by God, I forbid you to partake of the Christian mysteries. I anathematize you if you still bear a Christian name and belong by birth to the Orthodox Church. And you, faithful children of the Orthodox Christian Church, I beseech you to have nothing to do with this scourge of the human race. Quote, put away the wicked man from among yourselves, unquote. 1 Corinthians 5:13. Violent outrages are being committed against the Orthodox Christian Church. The blessed mysteries which sanctify the birth of man, of the union of husband and wife in the Christian family, are openly declared unnecessary and superfluous. Holy churches are being destroyed by gunfire, churches of the Moscow Kremlin, or looted and desecrated. The chapel of our Savior in Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Monasteries most revered by the faithful, such as Alexandro-Nevskaya or Pochachevskaya Lavras, have been seized by the godless rulers.
That's the very same church in Ukraine where the persecution of the monks was going on, and no one was allowed to go in and feed them or give them water, and they refused to leave. And Zelensky outlawed them the same day the Zionists in Israel blew up the St. Porphyrios Hall with all those innocent Christians in it. You could say, well, American Christians don't want to talk about that. They all think Stalin's bad. Well, we actually are talking about it. I mean, imagine if someone would give them a platform with a giant platform. But you know why they don't? Because you're a Marxist infiltrator that used to be a Bernie bro running around with Will Smith and shit. You're a liar. He's a liar. He's full of it. AstroTurfed.
Of darkness under the pretext that they are the people's property. Schools maintained by the Orthodox Church for the training of ministers and religious teachers have been declared useless and turned into either schools of atheism or into nurseries of immorality. Church monastery properties are being confiscated. Are being confiscated under the pretext that they are the property of the people. but the legitimate will of the people is never taken into consideration. And finally, the government, which promised to give Russia justice and truth and safeguard freedom and order, acts everywhere and toward everyone, including the Holy Orthodox Church, with unrestrained arbitrariness and violence. Is there no limit to this insolence? Is there no way of stopping the aggressiveness of the enemies of the Christian Church? I summon you, faithful and loyal children of the Church, come to the defense of your outraged and oppressed Holy Mother. I summon you, beloved children of the Church, even if you should have to suffer for the cause of Christ. For the apostle has said, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or anguish or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? And you, fellow prelates and priests, sound the call for the defense of the Orthodox Church. Without an hour's delay, organize unions of crusaders of the Spirit who can resist external force with the zeal of the faithful. And I firmly believe that the enemies of the Church will be vanquished by the cross of Christ, because the edifice of the divine crusader cannot be demolished. As he said, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Tikhon, the Patriarch of Moscow and all Russia. So I'm using a translation that I found out.
That's the anathema. And when he called everybody to actually suffer for the truth, so many Christians did. They reseeded Orthodoxy in Russia, even though everything's not perfect and there's cultural Christians and people that aren't the real deal. It's a far more traditional culture than it used to be, and more people are turning back to Orthodoxy. And this is part of what's inspired the conversion here in America. People are like, you're not a real Russian. It doesn't matter. Not everybody was from the Middle East when Orthodoxy spread throughout Russia, Ethiopia, over into Greece, over into Rome, out of the Middle East. Christianity spread that way, and there were converts in every group. We have saints. Is Saint Peter the Elliot? Is he a LARPer because he wasn't from Russia? Or Father Seraphim Rose, who's going to be the first American citizen to be a saint? Saint Olga, or any other saint? Saint Aidan of Lindisfarne in Ireland, was he LARPing the East? It's a dumb way of looking at this. And this course here, right, that Father Peter Heers gives, is the Russia's New Martyr course. Russia's New Martyrs, right here, and the Catacombs Church, a type of the end times. So if you want to take a look at that, you can actually learn a serious load of material and sources, well done, about what went down. And even if there's some superstition and exaggeration among the peasantry or whatever, the number of times people bore witness and had miraculous events and there were new saints made, even to the degree communists who had no incentive to tell the truth about it were gulagged and shot themselves and converted when they witnessed it, is astounding. There's a real witness to the true faith there. There's nothing like it in any other religion. With this anathema, we can move on to the critique of Islam, because that's the other branch of this, right? That's what Kerry Bolton is so adamant about, is Islam.
Mark. The Life and Final Homily of Father Daniel Syzoev. Father Daniel Syzoev was the oldest child of a Russian father, priest Alexei Nikolaevich. He believed that for the sake of missionary work, the Church needs to accommodate itself to the world. Father Daniel, on the contrary, took a maximalist stance with regard to both the church services and to the work of evangelization. This he believed to be the true missionary approach. Father Daniel's missionary work, while directed to all members of society, found its fullest expression in his approach to the conversion of Muslims. In 2007, he went on a missionary trip to Muslim-dominated Republic of Tatarstan. In the summer of 2008, he led a missionary group to Kyrgyzstan, and in 2009, another trip was made to Zainsk, one of the regional centers of Tatarstan. His missionary work to Muslims in Moscow involved visiting Muslim festivals and writing and disseminating missionary pamphlets, some of which were translated into the languages of the predominantly Muslim republics of the former Soviet Union. In 2005 and 2006, Father Daniel had a series of public debates with a former Orthodox priest who had converted to Islam. Many Muslims have become Orthodox Christians thanks to Father Daniel's efforts. He personally baptized 80 former Muslims into the Orthodox faith. But Father Daniel's effective missionary work and publicly disseminated critiques of Islam and other teachings contrary to Orthodox Christianity began to create enemies. By the time of his death in November 2009, he had received 14 death threats. On November 19th, at 10:40 p.m., a man wearing a surgical mask entered the St. Thomas Church and demanded to see Syzoev. The murderer was a Muslim who, according to a statement from a North Caucasus Islamist extremist group, had given a vow to execute the damned Syzoev. The man shot the choir director, who later recovered, and then Father Daniel, who reposed on the operating table the next day. Father Daniel was laid to rest behind the altar of the Church of the Icon of the Savior Not Made by Hands in the Kunstevo Cemetery in Moscow. His legacy continues.
Andrew Wilson had a good take on this. And by the way, that case of Daniel Syzoev, Father Daniel Syzoev, Hieromartyr. Well, there's tons of cases like that. We have tons of martyrs under the Ottoman Empire to new martyrs, many martyrs at the beginning of Islam. Father St. John Damascus had his hands cut off. You have new martyrs also under, in Turkey. The English at one point saw Islam as a good ally against Russia. So in the Crimean War, they worked with the Muslims. And this is what Dostoevsky is talking about when he brings up the cases that were all true stories of horrible evils happening in his brothers Karamazov. When Ivan Karamazov talks about Theodicy, talks about all these evils, there's cases of Muslims shooting Christian babies in the face after getting them to smile. Those were real things that actually happened. A lot of these guys are like, oh, that's just because of colonizing. Well, the Muslims colonized a lot of people too. It's a warrior religion. But it's able to be politically expedient and be nice when it needs to be and bend the rules. If it is an expedient to be all-out war at a moment, you could be friendly. And a lot of these people are being friendly right now because they need us against the Zionists, who are doing great evil and persecuting Christians. But we have our friends that are persecuted right now in places like Egypt, where by the populace that's also anti-Zionist, even though the government is coming to the aid of the Zionists. We have our, Coptic brothers and sisters over there talking about the rape and the oppression that they're facing, where our women are kidnapped and they try to force conversion. And then the response when you have honest people that admit this, that's just because you've been colonized. That's why you think that we're responsible for raping people and spreading Islamism and Muhammad hijab, going around talking about how we can do these things. and it's theologically justified. You just colonized your colonizer. Stop thinking like you colonized. That's like what you're not responsible for any of your actions because of colonialism. You're just adopting left-wing talking points while it's speaking out the other side of your lying face, telling us you're the solution to the left and liberalism. And Daniel Hikikaju does this at the academic level in debate. He upholds selective academics that speak highly of Islam and pretends the entire consensus is there for Islam, and then acts as though those who are critical of Christianity are only critical of the Christian literature in a higher criticism manner, as though nobody has those critiques of Islam. Then he ducks out and having that conversation with apostate prophet and gets mad that somebody's an atheist while claiming the atheists agree with Islam. It's a big crock of shit, and they're actually aiding the thing that they say they're going to stop, and they're going to be changed by it, and we can see that with these apostasy rates. Andrew Wilson here. Muslims aren't friends to the Christian. Many in their rush to condemn Israel have made this error in judgment. Zionists aren't friends to Christians. Many in their rush to condemn Hamas have made this error in judgment. Our path is narrow and our friends are few. Daniel Sizov. On this day 14 years ago, an Orthodox priest was martyred for preaching Christ to Muslims and seeing many convert to the Orthodox Church. An enraged Muslim entered this priest's church with a gun and shouted, "Where is the priest Daniel?" People ran out. Father Daniel was behind. The icon screen in the altar could easily have been escaped out the side door through the vestry. Instead, he stepped out from the altar into the nave of the church and said, "I am Daniel." He was shot to death in cold blood in the middle of the church. That's where he was shot, right there. So, we would say that Islam is false, that I would say Islam allowed the schism with the papacy, where the papacy made theological errors and then goes into scholasticism. And eventually the Greeks take their revenge upon the church instead of being kept in their place apologetically, where we weren't afraid of the truths they have to offer. This is one of the reasons Orthodoxy is doing so well, by the way, right now, even though it's very much outnumbered in America, because we can actually look at the philosophical and academic discussion and debate with it and assert our theology above philosophy, but also use the philosophical language and incorporate anything that is true underneath the Christian suppositions. So it scales down to people who aren't academics. An illiterate person could be a great Orthodox person. I would think that if you were a Muslim and you don't agree with me, you would also admit that you have people in Islam that don't need the sophisticated scholars and all this, but are good Muslims. Any religion that's going to be successful has to scale in that manner, but Orthodoxy is scaling up to a higher level, and you're also seeing the Muslims lose to Orthodox apologists, and where we would overlap with a traditional Catholic, somebody like Sam Shamoun, who knows the Quran, Orthodox Shahada. They're slaughtering you guys. Even where Hakikaju played a bad faith game and appealed to the scholars, the people that were watching that debate who didn't have a dog in the race could understand why Jay won that debate. And then we see on the Trinity versus Tawhid, Islam still has to come to the same kind of conclusions about reality being trifold to explain itself with an external word and scholarship, and it falls apart under their own justifications. The debates between Dr. Shabir Ali and Dr. Rashid Wood Dyer were excellent on this. Shamoun's debates were, even though we're not exactly the same on Islam, there's massive overlap there. Go watch the lectures from Orthodox Shahada. Before I get back to where this blends with the right and the way that fascism was amenable to Islam, we're also going to take a look at how some of our refutal of Islam before we do that. Then I want to get into Father Seraphim Rose and also on his case on Napoleon, and then into the Protocols of Zion too, because the critique overlaps in both directions, onto this Marxism and also into the fascism and this alliance with Islam.
Первый столб – это исповедание веры, которое, конечно же, не сводится только к исповеданию. Нет, конечно, кроме Мухаммеда, кроме Аллаха и Мухаммеда, пророка его, но оно включает в себя так называемую акиду, веру. Это вот акида, вера включает в себя первое, то, что есть и Аллах, некое существо, которое нельзя назвать личностью. Это очень важно помнить. Говорить, что Аллах личность, с точки зрения ислама, это недопустимо. Даже вот есть даже был вопрос такой, когда происходили переговоры между Римо-католической церковью и исламской уммой, возник вопрос, можно ли назвать Аллаха личностью. И выяснилось, что в арабском языке не существует просто языка, термина, который могло бы это слово просто описать. Слово «личность» наше переводится на арабский язык термином, который одновременно означает там «парнишка».
It's time for you to get your reading superpowered. So stop straining your eyes and start listening.
Там пацан, да, вот. У них вот эквивалентно по личность, пацан, вот, поэтому перевести его фактически так невозможно. Но и мы, конечно, по такому условию не смогли бы перевести, согласитесь, да, мы не можем сказать, там, Бог парнишка, это невозможно. Вот. А других терминов, которые могли бы описать личное существование Аллаха, не существует. Когда мне приходилось вести диспуты с мусульманами, я просто разговаривал с ними о жизни, вот этим летом, например, я беседовал с мусульманами в Турции, и спрашиваю, а кто такой Аллах для тебя? Он говорит, для меня Аллах – это некая великая сила, далекая, непонятная. Это, кстати, очень точное описание реального ислама. Реальный мусульманин не знает, кто такой Аллах. Это действительно сила, создавшая мир, давшая законы, которые всем вертят, но которые саму познать фактически невозможно. В Коране есть такие слова, что никто не приходит к Аллаху, как только рабу. И накладывается проклятие на иудеев и христиан, которые утверждают, что они могут быть детьми Божьими. Вот, и могут установиться Богу. Вот. И в связи с этим, конечно же, возникает такое отношение к Богу, как к далекой силе, которой необходимо поклоняться, но при этом кто он такой, мы почти не знаем. Существует такое понятие об атрибутах Аллаха, которые совечно с ним существуют. Что такое атрибут? Атрибут – это не просто качество, это некие качества, которые Аллах открывает о себе сам. Насколько они объективно соответствуют его природе, это вопрос спорный. Было две школы в средневековом исламе. Одни говорили, что Аллах действительно открывает о себе некоторые качества своей собственной природы, а другие говорили, что нет, это Аллаху угодно было так о себе сказать, а кто он такой на самом деле, ему не хочется говорить. Вопрос это в исламе нерешаемый, но тем не менее считается, что знание этих атрибутов очень важно. Ведь эти атрибуты известны как 99 имен Аллаха. Вот, может быть, видели мусульман, часто висят четочки, да, машины там, как амулеты там, или с четочками зелеными такими ходят мусульмане. Они ходят, перебирая эти четки, призывая каждый из имен Аллаха. Вот, причем это имеет такое некое, скорее, магическое значение. Хотя в суфизме, в таком мистическом направлении ислама, этим считается, что таким образом человек возгревает в себе любовь к Аллаху. То есть здесь есть некоторые элементы, которые заимствованы были из христианства, которые действительно истинны. Вот эти атрибуты, они противоположны. То есть один из атрибутов, например, любящий, милостивый, милосердный. Хотя не сказано, что он любовь. Сказано, что он только любит тех, кто любит его. Что он любовь, не сказано. Один из атрибутов его, то, что он говорящий, например. С другой стороны, есть, например, атрибут, что он тиран. Есть атрибут такой, что он автор зла. Вот. То есть, с точки зрения ислама, традиционно считается, что Аллах выше добра и зла, он является причиной и добра, и зла. Как сказано в Коране.
Right here you can see why to somebody like Nietzsche they would be amenable to Islam, beyond good and evil. Gnosticism can be amenable to Islam for this reason. Not just because you have flaky New Age people, which you do, who love Rumi, but also for this reason, you can be above good and evil. I wonder why the Fabian socialists like Islam and Sufism.
Если бы Аллах захотел, ему никто бы не предавался товарищей, то есть идолам. Вот. Но он сам сбивает с пути кого хочет и ставит на путь кого хочет. То есть и добро, и зло, оно от него. Есть хадис, приписываемый Мухаммаду, где сказано, что когда Аллах создал Адама, первого человека, Он кинул его за правую сторону нечто и за левую. И вот за левую, значит, за правое, за левое плечо его нечто. Он сказал, с правой стороны от тебя произойдут те люди, которые предназначены жить в раю, а с левой стороны от тебя произойдут те, которые предназначены быть дровами для ада. Это их такая судьба. И по исламскому представлению в 40-й день после зачатия архангел Джабриэль является перед лицом Аллаха и спрашивает, а что конкретно вот данному младенцу предназначено? И Аллах выдает ему списочек, что ему предназначено. И в этот момент архангел Джабриэль присылает ангела, который прикрепляет этот список к человеку, где описаны все его добрые и злые дела, которые он потом совершит. И кроме этого там написана судьба какая-то, у гражданина рая там, и гражданина ада, к примеру. Все это прикрепляется к человеку в 40-й день после его зачатия.
After enduring war and persecution, millions of refugees and displaced families are facing harsh winter weather right now. You can help. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, is on the ground around the world.
Take refugees too, right?
По исламским представлениям. Часть мусульман, наиболее фундаменталистских, считают, что Аллах ограничен пространством. Вот знаменитые ваххабиты, они утверждают, что Аллах перемещается. Он обычно живет на 7-м небе, а в ночь Рамадана, в ночь Откровения, он спускается на 1-е небо, чтобы лучше услышать слова тех, кто не молится. Поэтому в ночь Откровения необходимо все свои просьбы Аллаху высказывать. То, что он рядом, может услышать. Ислам категорически отвергает триединство Бога. В Коране существует несколько сур, которые направлены против триединства. Но причем интересно, что с каждой из этих сур мы тоже согласимся. Например, там сказано, что непростительный грех делают те, кто говорит, что Аллах третий из 3. То есть один из 3 богов. Мы, конечно, полностью с этим согласны. Вы, думаю, тоже согласитесь, да? Как может быть 3 бога отдельных, согласитесь? Или утверждается, что есть такой еще аят в Коране, где сказано, что Аллах спрашивает Иисуса: правда ли ты утверждал, что ты убеждал своих учеников, чтобы они взяли тебя дополнительным Богом ко мне вместе со своей матерью? Иисус говорит: нет, конечно, я такого не говорил. То есть представление Мухаммеда о христианах.
Why Allah asked Muhammad though? Didn't he know? Isn't he omnipotent? Why he have to ask Jesus this if you already knew? He straight forgot. You see, that logic doesn't apply to them there, right? They would understand this is a hyperbolic action within their own frame. But with the fig tree, they tell us Jesus forgot. He didn't forget. It was a hyperbolic action of withering the tree before, just like Israel. Israel didn't bear fruit. They had become wicked. They were sent to keep God's word, and then they fail. Christ completes the covenant and shows us how to be man and shows us how to worship God and gives us the full revelation. But those who reject that are cursed. Then he goes into the temple, drives out the money changers who had turned it into a corruption, predicts the destruction of the temple, claims his divinity, and then rejects and curses the scribes and the Pharisees and predicts the destruction of the temple, without which there can be no state of Israel. So this is why you see certain anti-Zionist Jews will say there should be no state of Israel, and they reject it, and they warned of how evil these people would be when they got to be in charge and have their state, and the things they would do and how racist they were. That's because they know. And these anti-Zionist Jews accept the destruction of the temple, even if they don't accept Christ as Messiah and his prediction. They do accept the idea that Daniel predicted the destruction of the temple. That's the abomination of desolation that Christ invokes. So, with this destruction of the temple, there is no state of Israel. So the Pharisees, who had claimed after the Babylonian captivity that they had secret knowledge at the base of the mountain to justify making changes and continually changing the traditions, that Christ says rejects their traditions, that they bring people in the wrong direction. They continue with this logic and change the Masoretic text. This does a lot of damage later when Protestantism starts adopting the Masoretic text. Luther does this. But then he hates it because he sees problems in it as though it's antagonistic instead of the fulfillment of a promise, and he loses the old hermeneutics. So he attacks it and hates it, but then he sets the stage for the same thing to be done against the New Testament. You'll see this will start to give power to the Jews, who play the same game, and they play with the merchants and the princes and the nobility that want freedom from Christianity. So this isn't just a one-way street. I talk about in another part of this conversation when I splice this whole thing together, how before the Jews had any power, the Italian mercantile class was attracted to the Kabbalah, but they were also attracted to Egyptian Hermeticism as a return to the origin. They were attracted to ideas out of Islam and alchemy. And this comes together with this sort of breaking free of the Greeks that Kerry Bolton upholds as what we need to return back to. It's kind of militarism, and you see so many pagans do this. You see people advocating Islam in this manner. You see Nietzsche being amenable to this as well, and having a more tragic vision as a good thing. But this is what gives power to the Zionists, and it's tied with people that want to empower the Muslims. But they play these games. You could see as soon as you actually scrutinize them, though, they start to fall apart. They have a Gnostic text that predated the Quran that they pull from, but then they claim that Muhammad just came up with this, though he was illiterate. He was obviously influenced by Nestorian elites and Persian elites that were Gnostic, who had this Gnostic text that they copied and pasted, and then they try to make a mathematical structure. Dante copying certain Muslims, then applying this to Greco and Catholic thought and scholasticism, as well as the Franciscan tradition and the Ignatian use of imagination. He comes up with a mathematically structured text too that mirrors itself in all three editions. The Purgatory, Inferno, and Paradiso actually have verses that mirror each other and even have like ideograms in them. To a point of precision, you could kind of start to try to make the kind of claims they do with the structure of the Quran, that nobody could do such a thing. Well, if you're engaged in sorcery and engaging with imaginary beings and spirits, you actually could. Muhammad has a demonic revelation.
Были совершенно превратные. И те проклятия, которые Коран сыпет в сторону христиан, мы с ними полностью согласны. Те, кто думает так, как обвиняют нас Коран, мы, конечно, их тоже анафематствуем. Ну, понятно, да? Как можно согласиться, что есть там три бога, где бы они поместились просто? Он же Бог вездесущий же. Итак, как можно отнестись к тому, кто такой Аллах? В общем, что это за существо? Ну, есть, во-первых, официальное решение собора Вселенской Церкви, это собор Константинопольский 1180 года. Собор о Боге Мухаммеда, где было подчеркнуто, что Аллах не имеет никакого отношения к Богу Библии. Это выдумка Мухаммеда, которую он сделал, основываясь на неправильно понятых рассказах из Ветхого и Нового Завета. Действительно, вот если так формально подойти, как можно отождествить Аллаха с Богом Библии? Из того, что некто говорит, что я там, не знаю, там, президент Путин, не следует, что он человек президент Путин, так ведь? Может, он обитатель дурдома, например. Поэтому и относительно Бога необходимо, чтобы какие признаки его истинного божества. Вот. Основные признаки божества, они, конечно же, в учении о Боге, они исчезают. Мы знаем, это некая далекая сила просто и все. Почти которые атрибуты, они непонятно, каким образом с ним сами соотносятся. У него, кстати, есть атрибут вечно существующий Коран. Считается, что рядом с Аллахом вечно существует его Коран, сосуществует с ним. Вот как он с ним существует? Это спор. Некоторые говорят, что перед лицом Аллаха вечно стоит зеленый трон, на котором лежит в софьяновом зеленом обложке великолепный Коран. Так называемая матерь книги, упоминаемая в Коране. Вот. И архангел Гавриил каждый раз, Джабраиль, он копировал определенную суру Корана и давал назубривать Мухаммеду. Таким образом, Коран был передан на землю. Вот. Единственное, что откуда-то мусульмане узнали, что написано на зеленом троне. Оказывается, на зеленом троне в качестве главного украшения именно Мухаммеда написано. Но это из области уже, скажем так, не вероучения официально, да, вот из таких разговоров их. Тем не менее, догмат о словесности Корана, он действительно существует, и он для нас является отказом от единобожия, который так яростно защищают мусульмане. Получается, существует два существующих неких вечных объекта. Итак,
Which economic system has proven to be better for countries around the world? Socialism.
Более того, если мы посмотрим на историю текста Корана, мы увидим очень интересную вещь. Дело в том, что Коран обличает многобожие, действительно, но при этом обличает очень интересно. Он обличает, что арабов то, что они предавали дочерей Аллаху. Действительно, арабы почитали 3 женских богинь. Это 3 женских божества, которые считались божествами Венеры, Луны там, и еще звезды одной. Звездные божества были. Вот. И при этом эти 3 женские божества считались дочерями главного бога Мекки по имени Хувал. Позднее, когда мусульмане встретились с иудеями и христианами, реальными, не еретиками, которые жили в Аравии, они все-таки стали отождествлять своего Аллаха с Богом, открывшимся через Писание. И здесь, конечно, мы должны сказать, что Бог, открытый себе через Писание, он не тот Бог, которого верят мусульмане. Это разные боги, и мы не можем сказать, что у нас один Бог с мусульманами. Как его сейчас можно объективно оценить? Объективно говоря, это некий умственный идол, которого создал Мухаммед. То есть Аллаха в таком виде, как он написан в Коране, не существует. Это некая искаженная карикатура на истинного Бога, возникшая в уме Мухаммеда под воздействием злой силы. Вот это будет наиболее объективная оценка представления об Аллахе сейчас. То есть связь с истинным Богом есть какая? Вот Николай Сербский сказал очень интересные слова. Он сказал, что раньше люди знали Бога как далекий-далекий костер видит, знаете, там, далекий свет. Они увидели издалека, видели, что это свет. Но каков он, они не знали. А потом Бог подошел к нам ближе к Богу воплощения, ближе всего. И мы видим тройственное пламя божества. Вот мы можем сказать, что Бог в состоянии ислама, это, скажем так, далекое-далекое божество, отцвет истинного Бога, который исказился в искаженном уме Мухаммеда, и который в результате затмил собой Бога истинного. И получился такой умственный стукан из истинных представлений. А более того, откуда там появились представления, такие совершенно дикие представления. Если вы почитаете Коран, вы увидите, что там дикие представления о Боге. Например, утверждается, что Бог там выдумывает совершенно изощренные пытки для своих врагов. Там сказано, что он любит тех, кто любит его, и ненавидит тех, кто его ненавидит. И при этом, например, те, кто его ненавидит, он скажет, что я их обрадую мучительным наказанием, они будут жариться в аду, и когда у них сгорит одна кожа, я им создам еще одну кожу, чтобы и она сгорела. И так будет вечно будет. Для своих врагов. Там сказано, что он любит тех, кто любит его, и ненавидит тех, кто его ненавидит. И при этом, например, те, кто его ненавидит, он скажет, что я их обрадую мучительным наказанием, они будут жариться в аду, и когда у них сгорит одна кожа, я им создам еще одну кожу, чтобы и она сгорела. И так будет вечно будет. А поить их будут там раскаленным железом. Вот. Ну, в принципе, что это такое? Вот если так по-русски подумать. Представьте себе обычного рядового человека, да? Который не борется с страстями, которого обидели. Что ему хочется? Отомстить обидчику, так? А если у него еще бесконечные силы, что он будет делать? Он бесконечно мстить будет обидчику, понимаете? То есть отношение какое? То есть человек рисовал Бога самого себя фактически, понимаете? Причем не совершенного человека даже, понимаете? А я же про Евангелие не говорю. Господь же говорит в Евангелии, кто любит любящих меня, какая ему награда? Ибо язычники любящих их любят. А вы любите врагов ваших, благословляйте проклинающих вас, молитесь за обижающих вас, чтобы быть детьми Отца вашего Небесного, который благ и к неблагодарным и злым. Вот если подумать даже чисто логически, то представление христианства, оно по определению ближе к истинному Богу, чем исламское представление, которое слишком человеческое, если угодно. Такой натуральный антропоморфизм, да, человека Божия.
This campfire analogy is important. Because it's the same kind of thing that St. Paul says about the unknown God of the philosophers. And this is where a lot of people are going with this, with Sufism, is to the unknown God of the philosophers. Same type of thing. St. Paul says it's like looking through a tarnished glass when they saw something coming close to God. This is the concept of logos spermaticos, where other cultures that worshipped false gods, to even function, they had to have the energies of God. They saw traces of this. Christ the Eternal Tao gets into this with the East. Very good one. I have playlists about all this stuff and our stuff against Islam. So in looking at this false god, they create an idol for themselves, even if they get into some truth, they're still there in falsehood. So in Romans 1, St. Paul comes up into the agora here and sees that they worship the unknown God. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for the images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them over, in the sinful desires of their hearts, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. Amen. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural sexual relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women, and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men, and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so God gave them over to a depraved mind, so that they do what ought not to be done. They have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of them who practice them. We see that in Islam too. Muhammad hijab right here.
If you look just at the Quran, you will get the indication that you can have sexual intercourse with a 5-year-old. The reason why it's haram to have sexual intercourse with a 5-year-old is not found in the Quran at all. If you just read the Quran, it is halal, it would be halal to have sexual intercourse with a 5-year-old. Chapter 65, verse 4. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us who you can divorce and who you cannot divorce. And then he says, وَاللَّائِ لَمْ يَحِدْنَ وَاللَّائِ لَمْ يَحِدْنَ, and the ones who had never been pubescent before. And by the way, this is very important, yeah? I want all Muslims to be aware of this. The reason why we don't have sexual intercourse with 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds or whatever is not because of puberty. Wait a minute, what did you say? It's not because of puberty, because that verse in the Quran actually says lam yahid. They never had puberty before. You can't go around that. The Quran doesn't say anywhere in the Quran that the woman has to be pubescent. I dare you to find one verse in the Quran where it says you're not allowed to marry someone based on harm, or you're not allowed to have sexual intercourse based on harm, or you're not allowed to marry someone based on puberty. Get me one verse in the Quran which says the woman has to be pubescent. No. You know, in the Quran it says حُرِّمَتْ عَلَيْكُمْ أُمَّهَاتُكُمْ. It says you're not allowed to marry your mum. It says you're not allowed to marry your sister, your auntie. Where does it say you're not allowed to marry a prepubescent? I'm looking for one verse that you can say, you pinpoint it and say this is where it says prepubescent marriage or whatever is not allowed. So if you're Quran alone, you're steered towards pedophilia, and a severe type of pedophilia, a wife abuse, a severe type of wife abuse.
But when we say it, we are Islamophobic. Stay away from Islam.
So we're going to stop degeneracy with this, right? Well, you go to Sneeko, who's got a type of Islam backing him right now that doesn't care about the quality of its converts. And quite often it's a kind of East Asian type of Islam that allows more degeneracy. It says you can basically do what you want. It's a more hedonistic form. And these guys this is kind of melding with this manosphere, the red pill crowd, and these celebrities to kind of bring this stuff in this manner. You could see the way this will go. So if we want to get a little further into here, let's get into, this is Ratio's The Milner-Fabian Conspiracy. I also had some selections from Anthony Sutton here about communism being funded, Trotsky and Lenin, and the Sisson documents and plenty more were funded by the Western elites, while Hinkle's backing this stuff like it's the cure for the West. It was a useful tool. The same with the Rakovsky interrogation. I would go watch The Secret History of Marxism by Jay Dyer. Gets deep into the Rakovsky interrogation and his lectures on Sutton. Major problem these guys are going to have, and they couldn't face that when they were all calling and trolling. They just all had to talk a bunch of shit, but they wouldn't get into those facts. I want to skip over that. I think we criticized communism fairly well enough. I want to get into the way a lot of these people, whether they're communist or Fabian socialist, or they're esoteric, or they're transhumanist, they like Islam, whether it's a tool or they actually start believing in itself, the way Kerry Bolton in that final chapter was talking about these Nazis that converted to Islam. A lot of elites like this religion because it enables these things, as we just talked about. It puts you beyond good and evil. You see it as a sociological tool. Napoleon saw it as useful. He wanted to write another Quran. I read that part in what will be the full version of this when I splice this live section in. I read Father Seraphim Rose's section on Napoleon as a forerunner of the Antichrist. And he actually he was a mystic. He supposedly had a daimon, that he could see that would warn him about things. And he said, this chapter that Bolton is writing, his postscript from the right, he jumps all over the place incoherently with all these different beliefs that are going to be useful. Julius Evola, paganism to stop degeneracy, but he critiques the sorcery and esotericism in the Jews with the Kabbalah. But then he's upholding somebody who's advocating magic and has something that looks a lot like the fucking Star of Remphan on his books about magic, right? So with this incoherent stuff, one of the thinkers he references in the reading that I'll put up soon is Gustave Le Bon, talking about Islam. Well, he quotes Napoleon as having said, "I was a Catholic to sign the Treaty of Vendée. I was a Catholic in Vendée. I was a Muslim to the Turks. And I was a Republican, a Jacobin for the French Revolution in Paris." So he would portray himself as whatever. And he talks about the section on Hitler and the Orthodox Survival Course by Father Rose. He brings up some philosopher that noticed how 1 second on the radio it's classical music, another second on the radio it's the news, and there's this like constant flow of information. This is long. Imagine now if this philosopher saw the internet age, where we're just constantly bombarded by the next thing. That this was a perfect place for someone to come out of nowhere, out of relative obscurity, like Hitler. You could see, I'm not saying Hinkle is Hitler, but it's almost like these people are little Hitlers or little Napoleons or little Stalins or little Lenins coming out of nowhere to be somebody. Anybody could come out of nowhere in the internet and be someone. You see how fast Hinkle blew up into something, into this cult of personality. It's insane. And with Hitler, he was an operative and he was supposed to stop the Nazis, but he saw what they were doing and was basically like, "Oh wow, they're doing it wrong. Let me show you how this shit's done. Let me show you how to really get Nazism going, get you going against the Jews." So we're gonna get into that section. So I'm not gonna read the section on Napoleon, but Napoleon wanted to write another Quran. He said he would have wrote another Quran if he could have actually conquered in Russia, and he knew he was gambling on this. But he needed this kind of mystique and godhood to be this world ruler. So you see, it was useful to him, and it's useful to these Fabian socialist elites. The Islamization of Britain. So, liberalism's offshoot, socialism, continued this process, leading to a breakdown of traditional culture. In the midst of this cultural decline, alternative, fabricated anti-Christian religions, like Freemasonry and Theosophy, began to proliferate. It was at the point that the Muslim missionaries and agitators, with establishment encouragement, began to infiltrate British society. Many of these missionaries were connected with the Islamic revivalist Al-Arg movement, led by Syed Ahmed Khan, the founder of the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College at Aligarth. In 1986, Khan's friend and collaborator Sir Thomas Walker Arnold wrote The Preaching of Islam, and between 1921 and 1930 taught Arabic Islamic studies. In the 1930s, Khan pioneered the idea of a separate Muslim state in India and collaborated with the Fabian Society member Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the creation of Pakistan, where they also persecute Christians. And we also, in those areas, used ones that were amenable to Marxism, and you're seeing that come back now through Stalinism, dialectical synthesis. However, among sections of the degenerate intellectual classes, traditional Islam failed to evoke wide interest in Britain. It's important to note here, later on, as the West keeps empowering more traditional and radical Islam, like we do with the Wahhabists in Saudi Arabia, who are our enemies, that there's a right wing that also starts taking advantage of being used as proxies and being abused by the West and having these wars that are eliminating so many Muslims and creating refugees. Well, they're also taking advantage of that. And now you're establishing, just like AIPAC, institutions like CARE, the Center for Arab Islamic Relations. So it's this left-wing use of them is often a softening before the more hardcore ones come in, and then you have both hardcore Sufis and hardcore Sunnis that take advantage of this and want to Islamize the West. That's the traditional interpretation. So it's theologically justified by them. And then they start to exert force just as the Zionists have. They have their NGOs too that are pro-Palestine, pro-Hamas, influencing our politics, as well as whatever amount is a top-down controlled dialectic and what is not, because not everything, we're not claiming that everything is controlled top-down, but people try to take advantage of these situations, and the dialectic exists, and it has influence by people with billions of dollars. Therefore, Muslim missionaries and their British collaborators resorted to promoting softer brands of Islam, such as Sufism. Sufism, and particularly the writings of the Iranian poet Omar Khayyam, have long been favored with Britain's left-wing elites. So you get into like stuff like Rumi too. Did you know that Rumi has verses on bestiality and pedophilia? What did we just read in Romans 1? The unknown God. When you don't actually worship God properly, you end up mixed up and in negative sexual places, just as we see with Julius Evola, and sex magic going back to the Greeks, just as you see people trying to do that and blend things together with Masonry, with our elites, just like the Pharisees that reject God and become the Zionists, when all these people blackmailing each other in our elites, given over to unnatural desires. Now, if you go through this more too, we get into King Charles being into this Sufism. He has a theosophical society he set up, and they bring in all kinds of perennialists, all teaching this kind of stuff. The Sufism, and it's useful to them because it's a lowest common denominator. It's very Neoplatonic, and they see it as a way to blend religions. Did you know that this was what the UN was founded on, was this kind of Sufic theosophy along with witchcraft? Ani Besant, you have the Blavatsky. All these people influenced the UN, and they're working today. They worked with Bill Clinton, and Ken Wilber met with Bill Clinton and worked with the UN on their thing, on their project to get rid of religious dogmas and blend everything together in a one world religion. They see Islam as very useful to this, whether it's bringing in more militant Muslims that are more traditionalist in the dialectic because they know they'll be absorbed, and you can see their apostasy rates, or the Sufism. So they actually have a little black cube that looks a lot like the big black cube, The UN has one in their special little meditation room to the unknown God, because they would like to reassert the unknown God of the philosophers. And you see this stuff is useful in perennialism with Henri Corbin, who influenced Jung. Jung stole a lot of his ideas from Henri Corbin. That's being used right now for these purposes of blending religious syncretism together with John Vervaeke and so many of his colleagues. And Charles Stang, with his divine double concept, he lifts that from this Sufic angelology. You'll also see in here, there's cases where Muslims were rioting and attacking people back in the early 1900s, and they used the same tactic. Well, you can't expect them to know how to act civilized when they're in a civilized country. Oh no. But when the Irish are rioting now, that's evil and bad because they're far right. The Islamization process. The Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, now King Charles, who's also pretending to be Orthodox like Hinkle, right? To blend these religions together. There's an Orthodox perennialist that they bring to this theosophical society called David New Year's that lectures on Henri Corbin. Prince Charles' well-known infatuation with Islam has given rise to fears that he may be a secret Muslim convert. Indeed, closer analysis shows that such fears are not unfounded. His interest in Islam, which became public in the 1980s, goes far beyond the usual official pandering to Muslim interests. In 1993, Prince Charles gave a speech at the Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, of which he is a patron, in which he infamously dismissed the view that Islamic Sharia law, which prescribes public beheading, stoning to death, and limb amputation for various offenses, is cruel, barbaric, and unjust in its thinking, was just prejudice peddled by the newspapers. In the same speech, he claimed that medieval Islam was a religion of remarkable tolerance. You hear all this stuff from multiculturalism, right? Prince Charles urged Western environmentalists to follow the Islamic approach to nature, describing the Islamic world as a custodian of mankind's wisdom and spiritual knowledge. Similarly, speaking at the opening of a new building at the Marketfield Institute of Higher Education, he played the old revisionist record on Islam's supposed contribution to the European Renaissance, after which he emphasized the need for the study of Islam. So, Kerry Bolton does this in the final chapter too, and they definitely made contributions, but they weren't responsible for all of it. There's Byzantium, I get into this in the reading, but they're also responsible for a lot of the alchemy and the esotericism that comes in and blends with everything that was bad about the Renaissance. So this text here goes through all that, and then it gets into some of the same details that overlap, and I am grateful for Bolton getting into, was our use, the chapter America's Jihad, and another chapter gets into the Western use of Islamic terror in Eastern Europe. Rothschild was a funder of that, to use Muslims against the Christians, but it's not as though they had no agency. See, they're involving themselves in age-old hatreds and combats that are already there. They wouldn't be able to just pay them to go kill Christians and have them just do it. There's a desire to do that, and that's the same reason Britain saw Turkey as an ally in the Crimean War. They did this in Kosovo. They're doing it right now in Armenia. World War Now talks about a lot of that. What I want to get into now is back to Bolton, who wants to syncretize these things together, and the lies they're telling you, because Zionism bad, Islam good. No, this is another dialectic. This is one of the things Bolton actually admits, is that a lot of these Zionists, like the non-Zionist elites, are dialecticians. They have dialectical metaphysics just like the Marxists. And the goal of this dialectic is to incorporate eras. This is the purpose. This is what they want, is to incorporate eras and bring us to a false understanding of God. This is why Satan wants this, so that we'll have a false religion and a false understanding of God, in which good will be evil and evil will be good, and will be accepted as Christian. more Christian than Christ. That's how the Antichrist will portray himself. And people will buy into it, and they already do. You see left-wing people do that. You see right-wing people do it because they need to solve problems and stop suffering in their way. You see the neocons do it in a more entrepreneurial type of capitalism, but it's still globalist, and it's a new world order in which religion is just a religious positivism subjected to them. We see this Napoleonic streak and how influential it is with Hitler, who was also amenable to Islam. And even though he outlawed all these secret societies, they still existed with Mussolini. I talked about that in the reading. That will be attached to this when I make the larger version. And that was where all the blackmail went on to infiltrate the Vatican. That's why we have a WEF Pope. That's why I believe so many people were covered up and allowed to continue molesting kids. And you can see right-wing versions of this. They're basically a right-wing form of Jacobins. And the ideas that were going around, like I don't think there was just an Illuminati in charge of anything. That's not my claim. But the ideas that were going on from Gumestos Platon to influence Spinozism much later on, what went down in the Renaissance, what happens in your Munster Rebellion, people coming to these kind of ideas, they were very prevalent behind the scenes, whether there was a more Girondist and conservative version of this. It's still this kind of classical liberalism, but then it also becomes demonic with the Jacobins. Outright demonic. So I want to get into the Protocols of Zion here. And this is from Father Seraphim Rose's Orthodox Survival Course. The Protocols of Zion. There is one last document we should look at in this period of the beginning of the 20th century before the great revolutionaries of our century, which is a rather controversial document. It is called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and because it presents itself in the form of a Jewish document, it has aroused a great deal of dispute. If you read any history book, of the two world wars especially, in fact, any history book written before the Second World War, you will find there an almost universal statement that, quote, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, end quote, are a fabrication, deliberately to discredit the Jews. That is a totally fantastic thing which has no reality to it. And they will point out that either the person who discovered it was himself an agent of somebody and therefore deliberately fabricated them, or else, as at least one source states, that he was fooled by the Tsarist police, who simply wanted to invent these in order to make an excuse for eliminating the Jews and the pogroms. There are others who take the document so seriously they tend to go in the other extreme, and they see everywhere a Jewish plot so much that they can hardly take a step without fainting. We must try to look at this document somewhat objectively, to see what it actually is, what is actually in it, how it was found, and what is its significance. From the Orthodox point of view, it is most interesting how it was presented to the world for the first time. It was discovered by a lady, we do not know who gave it to the person who printed it, and it is supposed to have come from the West, and to have been written in French and then translated into Russian. But the person to whom this document was given was a man by the name of Sergei Nilus, who printed it together with another document which he had recently discovered, the Conversation of Motovilov with Saint Seraphim. He presented these two documents to the world at the same time in order to show that 1. What is the truth of orthodoxy and the acquirement of the grace of the Holy Spirit, and 2. What is the plot of Satan to overthrow orthodoxy? It was printed in 1905, 1903, and we're going to always give more authority to these saints, which should never have been taken away from them and given to the intellectuals and anybody with an idea in a printing press, an idiot like me who can just sit here and talk. I point up to them because they're above us. And even if they're even if they can be fallible at times, they're much more respected and much more honest, and live in a way you can trust much better than anybody else. And I don't think they're lying about this. Nilus himself was a very respected ecclesiastical writer, a popular journalist who went to Aptina and even lived there, various other places. There can be no doubt that he had nothing to do with making a forgery. He accepted this text as quite legitimate and presented it to the world as a warning. We will see that the text has 2 new points in it, which have not come out in previous revolutionary documents, but apart from these, it is exactly the same philosophy as that of Bakunin, Weishaupt, and all these other thinkers. Some people say it is not a very original document, it is plagiaristic, etc., and that is probably so, because all these ideas were circulating, and this particular document, in fact, we see that one writer, Webster, compares on one side of the page the protocols, and on the other side of the page the text of Weishaupt written in 1785. So from Platon to people coming upon these types of ideas in the Munster Rebellions, the French Revolution, the influence all this had there, to what goes on in all these different clubs and secret societies that Dostoevsky writes about because he was a part of like a lesser one that might not have been that important. These were in circulation everywhere, and it's the same with the Illuminists, it's the same with the Theosophists. Rachel Wilson's going to be doing a book on the occult stuff that was going on behind the scenes in communism and the occult feminism that would influence this stuff, and that there was blackmail, all that. These ideas are running, very similar ideas are running around in all these clubs. It's almost like a virus that spreads and sets up like a terror cell type of protocol. So no one, if one of them goes down, somebody else can continue spreading this mind virus. The philosophy is the same. And so most likely this is a legitimate document, which is some kind of notes taken at a lodge of people who happen to be Jews. And they present the philosophy in a very Jewish way. Just as earlier there were people who presented the revolution as a triumph of Pan-Germania, and others presented the idea that the whole world would become some sort of a French republic. And this took form of some Jewish Masons or Illuminati who represent the revolution as their plot. There are some ideas here which are most significant for us. Whether they are actually responsible for the French Revolution, as they say, and whether they are so influential, who can say? The Billington text is really good on this, and Tristan, as well as Dyer, lectured on it with Dostoevsky's Demons, and Father Seraphim Rose he brings up in his Nihilism a lot. That's a great talk right there. It's a two-parter. I have it actually in my playlist on Marxism, Illuminists, and Revolutionaries. We have seen that all these secret societies are so small, so split up, so secret, so full of secret signs and handshakes and invisible ink, etc. Who can possibly decipher who is actually responsible for what? Our view is that this is most symptomatic of the philosophy which is going on at this time. And we shall later on see that this particular document had a definite role to play in Germany. The philosophy which is described in this document is one of absolute ruthlessness in bringing about a revolutionary government and in the means used to bring it about, the using of people like Marx and Buchanan, utter hypocrisy, killing off your enemies, spreading pornography in order to corrupt the youth. No shortage of that, right? Causing revolutions, taking first the side of the monarchs, then the side of the socialists, then the side of the liberals, Democrats, taking any side in order to push across your point of view and eventually come into power. They talk about the control of the press, control of the money, etc. Here follows a few excerpts to show the spirit of this document. He who wants to rule must have recourse to cunning and hypocrisy. We must not stop short before bribery, deceit, and treachery. If these are to serve the achievement of our cause, and this very philosophy can be found in the Talmud, which says anything is possible, you can deceive any non-Jew, a goy, for your own purposes. The end justifies the mean. In making our plans, we must pay attention not so much to what is good and moral, as to what is necessary and profitable. With the press we will deal in the following manner. We will harness it and will guide it with firm reins. We will also have to gain control of other publishing firms. All news is received by a few agencies, in which it is centralized from all parts of the world. When we attain power, these agencies will belong to us entirely, and we will only publish such news as we allow. No one desirous or attacking us with his pen would find a suitable publisher. It is interesting to note here, all of the groups in the world, the Jews are the ones who are strongest in this department, because it is not possible to mention the Jews in even a slightly critical tone without having a representative of the Anti-Defamation League come to visit. This is why Orthodox publishers are very careful not to say anything about the Jews, because they know that someone will come around and begin checking up on them. And if there is something they don't like, they'll start conducting a campaign of slanders and arousing public opinion and all sorts of things against you. There are some people who talk about the Jewish peril. Of course, they go overboard about it, like Gerald K. Smith, whose main emphasis is the Jewish peril, and he is crazy about it. Our program will induce a third part of the populace to watch the remainder from a pure sense of duty and from the principle of a voluntary government service. It will not be considered dishonorable to be a spy, or on the contrary, it will be regarded as praiseworthy. And Plato has the same idea with the Council of Night. We will transform the universities and reconstruct them according to our own plans. The heads of the university and their professors will be specially prepared by means of elaborate secret programs of action. We intend to appear as though we were the liberators of the laboring man. We shall suggest to him to join the ranks of our armies of socialists, anarchists, and communists. The latter we will always patronize, pretending to help them out of fraternal principle and general interest to humanity evoked by our socialistic masonry. In the so-considered leading countries, we have circulated an insane, dirty, and disgusting literature. In the place of existing governments, we will place a monster, which will be called the administration of the super-government. Its hands will be outstretched like far-reaching pincers, and it will have such an organization at its disposal that it will not possibly be able to fail in subduing all countries. We shall have an international super-government. So that's the Protocols of Zion, and now we're going to compare it to Weishaupt. This is back to Weishaupt, the French Revolution, and the ideas of internationalism. We shall destroy the family life of the Gentiles. We will also distract them by various kinds of amusement, games, pastimes, passions, public houses, etc. The people of the Christians, bewildered by alcohol, their youths turned crazy by classics and early debauchery, to which they have been instigated by our agents, by our women in places of amusement. And look at how we are today. The Masonic Lodge throughout the world unconsciously acts as a mask for our purpose. And this isn't just Masons. We're not claiming everything is a plot of the Freemasons. It's the power of the type of ideas and the way this model is used everywhere. Most people who enter into secret societies are adventurers who want somehow to make their way in life, who are not seriously minded. With such people, it will be easy for us to pursue our object, and will make them set our machinery in motion. Of course, this is the idea behind many of these people and groups, and that we have the real secret society and we are going to manipulate all these other people. The communists are constantly infiltrating the anarchists, the socialists, everybody else, and nobody can trust anybody anymore. Nobody knows who is behind what. Quote, we employ in our service people of all opinions and parties, men desiring to reestablish monarchies, socialists, etc. Quote, we have taken great care to discredit the clergy of the Gentiles in the eyes of the people. You see this demoralization right now on display with the Vatican. We see it with gay, transgender clergy. There was a Protestant who said, who has a church of queer theory and sexual liberation, talking about to get ready for your G-bang with the man upstairs in church. You see Rupnik having his, I believe it's Rupnik who did a Crowleyan ceremony and had molested people and put semen into the chalice. It's complete demoralization to discredit the clergy. And then anytime I talk about people actually advocating for drag queens to have their balls in front of kids, what about the priest though? What about the priest though? Well, this is the discrediting, and it has done damage to making a case for Christianity. The clergy of the Gentiles in the eyes of the people, and thus have succeeded in injuring their mission, which could have been very much in our way. The influence of the clergy on the people is diminishing daily. Today, freedom of religion prevails everywhere. But the time is only a few years off when Christianity will fall to pieces altogether. We must extract the very conception of God from the minds of the Christians. We must destroy all professions of faith. We persuaded the Gentiles that liberalism would bring them to a kingdom of reason. We injected the poison of liberalism into the organ of the state. And liberalism, according to Father Seraphim Rose, is a neutral breeding ground that allows these ideas. But these ideas are the undergirding of communism. This is the very same communism, the Leninism, the Marxism that Hinkle upholds as the solution to this very problem. And he very likely works for some of these kind of people. We will prearrange for the election of presidents whose past is marred with some Panama scandal or shady hidden transaction. You can't find one honest politician. you're always making a trade-off because all of them are wrong in some way today. They go on to talk about they're creating a universal money crisis using the Masonic lodges. Tragedy and Hope gets into this, how they understand the boom-bust cycle. If we want to get outside the orthosphere and all this stuff, you can take a look at Murray Rothbard talked about how J.P. Morgan and the railroads actually hired a man named Fink, just like the WEF has a guy named Fink pushing the DEI and ESG. He was an expert, and he went and investigated on how they could establish a monopoly and cartelize and set up cartels for the railroads, because the two big government-backed railroads were being killed by the Great Northern Railroad. And he came and said that you couldn't establish a cartel in a real free market, and advocated ways to do this. But one of the things Rothbard and these libertarians misunderstand is that by having free markets, you start moving things out of the country. We don't have real free markets, and they've monopolized against that at the larger level, and the biggest pushers of communism are capitalists that are winning at capitalism. There's a problem with putting these suppositions before God, and we are reaping the fruits of that, and that we are coming to this technocracy and this Fabian socialism that is amenable to synthesizing communism with capitalism. But you see how they understood the boom-bust cycle. You see one of the Rockefellers was a gold standard guy, but now they don't find it useful anymore. So they understand how free markets would actually work in theory, as a Hayek or a Rothbard advocates. They don't care, and they're not going to do it, and they intentionally break the economy. You can see them doing that right now for CBDCs. We must take no account of the numerous victims which will have to be sacrificed in order to obtain a future prosperity. There are two new things to this whole plan. Of course, they ascribe all this to Jewish power, and undoubtedly there are Jewish groups like that who think that they are going to conquer the world. The two, you see, Netanyahu just talked about how they were going to fulfill Isaiah and bring in a new Messiah. The two new ideas in them are, however, they are not atheistic. They believe in one world religion. They say in the 14th protocol, when we come into our kingdom, it will be undesirable for us that there should exist any other religion than ours of the one God, with whom our destiny is bound up by our position as the chosen people, and through whom our same destiny is united with the destinies of the world. We must therefore sweep away all other forms of belief. If this gives birth to the atheists whom we see today, it will not, being only a transitional stage, to interfere with our views, but will serve as a warning for those generations who will hearken to our preaching of the religions of Moses, and that, by its stable and thoroughly elaborated system, has brought all the peoples of the world into subjection to us. Therein we shall emphasize its mystical right. Of course, this is in accord with the more profound revolutionaries who saw the revolution must become religious in the end. Atheism is only a transition in order to get rid of previous religious views. And we've seen here the Epstein Island model that has these Mossad ties. You have men with Babylonian sex temples in the government who also have non-materialist, physicists and stuff working on their projects, and people like Michael Aquino, people like Jack Parsons, the way they used Crowley as an agent. You have all these people that don't have materialistic views, pushing materialism. Lawrence Krauss, Steven Pinker, Daniel Dennett all went to Epstein Island right before New Atheism became big. All these different New Atheists were funded by the Edge Foundation. Epstein funded. A tool. It's a de-initiation and a de-incarnation that prepares you for needing something else, and then this stuff leaves the intellectuals and ends up in the hands of the populace in the vitalist stage of the dialectic. And this is what we're seeing now that the men of action are coming in, and this is coming down to the street level, and you're having people like your Gage and your Hinkle. And you don't know who's going to come along. You might get somebody who's a much more real deal than, Jackson Hinkle being a little glowy. Maybe you get some real general, like a Napoleon. Maybe we have enough hardship and enough people die over time, and someone like that steps up and seizes the throne and blends the religion together. I mean, this is what the Antichrist will do one day. He will make peace. In the meantime, while we are re-educating youth in new traditional religions and afterwards in ours, we shall not overtly lay a finger on existing churches, but we shall fight against them by criticism calculated to produce schism. The second new ingredient in this revolutionary proposal is that there will be a one-world monarch. The third protocol reads as follows. Ever since that time, we have been leading the peoples from one disenchantment to another, that in the end they should turn also from us in favor of that king despot of the blood of Zion, whom we are preparing for the world. It is possible all the same to the world, who is its sovereign lord, whether this be the head of the Catholicism or our despot of the blood of Zion, but to us, the chosen people, it is very far from being a matter of indifference. We see here that it is already a rival to the Pope as a world ruler. This is a prediction, too, in Dostoevsky, that they will corrupt the Pope. And he sees the Pope as corrupt in the Grand Inquisitor, advocating how they will offer a more worldly religion, and men will tire of stealing fire from the gods with all this technology and the failure to build churches, and that people will turn back to the Vatican. And they'll have false teachings, and you can see how that's set up and how they have this interfaith center already for when all this stuff bottoms out and all this apostasy and the state of Protestantism and the way it's having to be rebuilt upon Carl Jung right now and metamodernism. The 10th protocol. The recognition of our despot may also come before the destruction of the Constitution. The moment for this recognition will come when the peoples, utterly wearied from the irregularities and incompetence, a matter which we shall arrange for, of their rulers will clamor, away with them and give us one king over all the earth, who will unite us and annihilate the causes of discord, frontiers, nationalities, religions, state debts, who will give us peace and quiet, which we cannot find under our own rulers and representatives. This is the call. Get rid of the Zionists and everything's going to work. You can see them pulling Islam in. You can see Ryan Dawson pushing the rank materialism that was part of the tool used by these people while we move towards one world religion. And he plays that game too. Just get rid of all this incompetence. As long as we get rid of the Jews, it'll all be good. And what does he say? He says, get rid of the religions. Religion is the cause of these wars. Do you think we didn't fucking try that with communism? How are you going to get rid of religion? You go interfere in these religions, which the secular world has done, doing all this stuff, doing Operation Gladio in the Vatican, sowing in communism, sowing in the false church in Ukraine, and people would rather die than allow that, getting involved in Islam too. I'll say there are traditionalist Muslims, even though we think it's a false religion, who are engaged in virtue and normalcy in their own place and are fighting against this degeneracy being pushed into their religion. They push this stuff into the Islamic religions too, and you've seen it affect Islam very quickly with little exposure to the West. But you're seeing liberal forms already adopting LGBTQ. I brought in that Slayer video and that psyop there. So you know what, if you go and do that in somebody's religion and try to distort it and turn it degenerate so you have puppets, it's going to piss those people off, especially if they really believe. So you see secular involvement here. This idea to get rid of all religious barriers. No shit, this is the pan-heresy of ecumenism. It removes truth to solve worldly problems. When the king of Israel sets upon his sacred head the crown offered him by Europe, he will become patriarch of the world. The indispensable victims offered by him in consequence of their suitability will never reach the number of victims offered in the course of centuries by the mania of magnificence, the emulation between the Goy governments. Our king will be in constant communion with the peoples, making to them from tribune speeches, which we will in the same hour distribute all over the world. The Supreme Lord, who will replace all now existing rulers, it says in the 23rd Protocol, dragging on their existence among societies demoralized by us. Societies will have denied even the authority of God, from whose midst breaks out on all sides the fire of anarchy, must first of all proceed to quench this all-devouring flame. They're going to provide the solution to the problem they made with some great man. Therefore, how primed are we to some great man? Some great Hinkle is going to come, and it doesn't matter if he's bad, because he's exposing people to the problem. Donald Trump's going to solve it all. Barack Obama was treated like he was the second coming of the Messiah. Napoleon was treated like that. People talked about him as though he was Christ. Therefore, he will be obliged to kill off those existing societies, though he should drench them with his own blood. that he might resurrect them again in the form of regularly organized troops fighting consciously with every kind of infection that may cover the body of the state with sores. This chosen one of God is chosen from above to demolish the senseless forces moved by instinct and not by reason, by brutishness and not humaneness. These forces now triumph in manifestations of robbery and every kind of violence under the mask of principles of freedom and rights. They have overthrown all forms of social order to erect on the ruins the throne of the King of the Jews, but their part will be played out the moment he enters into his kingdom. Then it will be necessary to sweep them away from his path, on which must be left no knot, no splinter. Then will it be possible for us to say to the peoples of the world, God gives thanks to God. Give thanks to God and bow the knee before him, who bears on the front the seal of the predestination of man, to which God himself has led his star, that none other but him might free us from all the aforementioned forces and evils. All this is deeply in accord with the philosophy of the Talmud, of the desire of the Jews for a Messiah, who is of this world, and it is not surprising that there should be some kind of Jewish organization which has this philosophy. The philosophy is actually that of Marx, the ruthlessness, the using of everybody else for his own purpose, the establishing of the one world rule, everything except the fact that Marx did not believe in God. The interesting thing about this document is the historical significance it was placed to in the 20th century. A certain man named Rosenberg, who came from Russia to Germany after the revolution, brought this book with him and showed it to Hitler, who immediately saw in this something which he could use from 2 points of view. One, by showing this to the people, it would inflame their hatred for the Jews, because they are trying to establish a world monarchy. And he could blame all the problems of Germany on them, the currency crisis, the depression, the unemployment, etc., and say this is a secret society trying to take over Germany. And you're seeing this. I don't think a lot of these people actually want to solve the problem, rather than actually killing the Christian Zionism, without which there's no Zionism, and bringing in the Orthodox case. They'd rather get on this bandwagon and be somebody, and it's easy to tell people there's only one problem in the world, which is the Jews. So you're seeing like lower level versions of this. And 2, Hitler, he admitted the book was very well written. I will use that as my philosophy to govern. And so this document became one of very important sources for the National Socialism of Hitler, who placed himself in the place of the world monarch of the Jews. Now we will look at all 3 great movements in the 20th century, which prove that all these philosophers were not simply idle thinkers. They were speaking of things that were entering into reality, the 3 great totalitarian systems in the 20th century. One of them is not particularly important to us, and that is the system of Mussolini, the fascist. It is perhaps not much appreciated that in his youth Mussolini was a Marxist. He took part in many Marxist demonstrations. He talked about the dictatorship of the proletariat, the coming of the communist state, the withering away of the state. Was a radical, just like any other Marxist demonstrator. When he got a chance to come into power, he saw that by combining various elements of society and giving one message to one and one to another, he could come to power on a platform which looks a little different, and therefore he developed this fascism, which is a romantic kind of socialism, and even got the king on his side, and made a concordat with the Pope, and therefore became a dictator on a basis which is not absolutely communism, but is based on the same ruthless dictatorship. So this is not an example of the ruthless communism as such, but the same kind of man which is produced by communist philosophy. Your presuppositions. The fact that he was allied with so-called right-wing forces is only incidental. His idol was Lenin, because Lenin was one who had power and took over, and therefore he based his system on Lenin. And that is the practical system of how to get power. Now I want to bounce over to Hitler. We've already critiqued communism enough, and this will piggyback off the part with Napoleon. We will now go to Hitler, about whom we won't say too much, and then come back to discuss the points in common of Nazism and communism. Hitler's whole system of National Socialism is, without going into his romantic side of it, his love of Wagner, the twilight of the gods, his romanticism. In a word, his system is Bolshevism, again with some compromises, like Mussolini, made in order to gain control of the ruling elements. But basically his philosophy is Bolshevism adapted to a different value scale. In Bolshevism, everything is interpreted in terms of economics and class. There is a class war, of the lower class against the upper class. Hitler has the same thing, only instead of a class, he has a racial war, Germany against the world. His system is quite millennial, and in fact he called his empire the Thousand-Year Reich, the Thousand-Year Empire, which is directly from the Apocalypse. So this is dispensationalism. This is the same Chiliasm that breaks out, that there's going to be a new age. This is the same thing the Christian Zionists believe in. This is the same thing the Marxists believe in. The transhumanists believe in this. It's a spirit that undergirds everything and leads to the apotheosis of man instead of theosis. He's a typical example of an uprooted man. He has no belief in God, no morality, no higher values, and he felt a deep kinship to Bolshevism. Like Napoleon, he thought of resurrection of the Roman Empire, but also like Napoleon, he recognized that the times were not suited for that. Jews, his plans. Lenin, his model. He felt kinship to Bolshevism when he all but said, the future belongs solely to the stronger nation. He says this when he's losing to the Eastern nation, that the future belongs to Bolshevism. Goebbels actually talks about how all this destruction and the death of Germany is necessary to bring out something new from the ashes. His relationship to the Jews is most interesting because he used the Jewish question as a scapegoat. Like the Bolsheviks used the middle class, the bourgeois. Every time something goes wrong, it's the fault of the bourgeois saboteurs or the big peasants who are trying to kill or overthrow the government. And therefore, you kill off 1 million more and you're safe for a while. With Hitler, this took the form of the Jews and a whole romantic mystical philosophy of race, in which the Germans are the superior race and others. They have a whole hierarchy of them, the Gypsies, Poles, and so forth. Go lower and lower. This is a caste system. This is influenced by Hinduism. Jamie Hanshaw has a good talk about that too, on the hidden dangers of the rainbow and how they got a lot of these mystic ideas and theosophy influenced this Nazism. The Russians are somewhere in the middle. They're pretty low. And he was looked at by one person who was close to him, a certain Hermann Rosching, who in the 30s and early 40s was writing. He escaped in about 1938. He was an ordinary mayor of Danzig, and at first thought that Hitler was going to save conservatism. But he became very close to him, and had many long talks with him, and began to see that the man is crazy. Might not be crazy, but he has a very, very definite philosophy, which is absolutely unheard of. And he was the one who first came out and began to tell the world, that is, this man is standing for, based on his conversations. At one conversation he had with him, he said, "Why are you so upset about the Jews? Why do you have to be so fanatical about the Jews?" And he said, "What characterizes the Jews?" And Rosching said, "Well, they think they're the chosen people. They have some kind of a messiah complex." And he said, "Yes, just that. And what about Germans? If we are the master race, and if we are going to conquer the world, how can we allow that there will be another people who has the idea that they are the chosen people? If the Jews are the chosen people, the Germans cannot be the chosen people. And therefore we must exterminate the Jews so the Germans may take their place. And I will be their Messiah." That is, the Messiah of the Germans. And he even said that in one place, "If you like, I will be the Antichrist. It's all the same to me." How much commonality with Napoleon here? Hitler had the idea. He was a very unreligious person himself, had no God or anything, but like Napoleon, he was very interested in the religious question, and he said, "After I've conquered the world, I shall then give my greatest contribution to humanity. I will solve the religious question." He didn't say exactly how it was going to be solved. He did say that he would cause to be erected in all high places, high mountains, throughout the world, telescopes, and underneath the telescope would be written the inscription, "To the unknown God." We were just talking about this. With Islam, with the UN, with Romans, Julius Evola. And you see these Nazis got involved in so much homosexuality too. And of course, if he did become the world conqueror, he would not very well have been able to resist the temptation to think that he was a god. But the fact that he had this idea of solving the religious question makes him like Napoleon, one of these forerunners of Antichrist. He hated the Western democracies. By the way, he abolished all secret societies. Excuse me, I got a sore throat here. For him, everything was a Jewish Masonic plot. The Masons were not allowed to exist, of course, but for the same reason that the Communists destroyed all secret societies and Napoleon destroyed all secret societies, because the one in power does not need any secret society. They only cause, he knew himself, having gone through all kinds of secret societies, that these were stirring up discord. And of course, he was fighting against Bolshevism because he recognized that there are two who are fighting for the supremacy of the world. One of us must conquer it. And when it came to the last days in Berlin, we have his notes preserved from his last days, and he saw that he was going to lose. And then he could not bear the thought that the British and Americans had defeated him because he so regarded them as effeminate, weak, backwards, and out of date. And so he said, as his last kind of statement, the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. As though he gave his inheritance to Bolshevism, which shows he recognized they're the same kind of power that brought him to power. This primordial revolution that's going to conquer the world and destroy the past. Hitler said when he was still coming to power and had already the thought of world empire, "We may be destroyed, but if we are, we shall drag with us a world in flames." And we see here the same impulse behind the Commune of Paris, which wanted to destroy Paris. You see Kerry of Nantes, who actually buried people up to their neck and had their eyes stabbed out before they were trampled by horses, said we shall turn all of France into a graveyard before we allow it to be regenerated in any other way. They're one of Stalin's Chekistas, who was in charge of of killing and torturing people, actually copied a lot of these crimes of Kerry of Nantes. He replicated the Nantes drownings, flayed people alive, burned people alive. He was a demon. In the last days of the war, when obviously Germany was invaded on all sides and 14-year-old boys were being sent out to fight, the end was obviously near. Germans were fighting on to the last moment. By the way, we should not think that the Reich of Hitler was to be compared with the Bolsheviks, because in all respects Hitler was much more humane. It was possible to talk with the SS, to the Gestapo. It was possible to talk them out of sending you to a prison camp. You could expect to some extent, some justice from there. And anybody who lived under both Hitler and the Communists, they will tell you there was no choice. They always went back to Germany whenever the battle lines changed. We know many who were in Germany during that time. And they say that, of course, it was a kind of crazy place, and Hitler was very strange. Nonetheless, some kind of normal life was still possible. Whereas under the Bolsheviks, the totalitarianism is absolute. So in that sense, Hitler is a small imitation of the Bolsheviks. He was still very much compromising with the past. But in the last days of the war, his propaganda minister Goebbels explained on the radio something which sounds very Marxist as the bombs were falling all around. The bomb terror spares the dwellings of neither rich nor poor. Before the labor offices of the total war, the last class barriers had to go down. Together with the monuments of culture, there crumble also the last obstacles to the fulfillment of our revolutionary task. Now that everything is in ruins, we are forced to rebuild the empire. In the past, private possessions tied us to a bourgeois restraint. Now the bombs, instead of killing all Europeans, have only smashed the prison walls which kept them alive. In trying to destroy Europe's future, the enemy has only succeeded in smashing its past, and with that everything old and outworn is gone. So the aim of Nazism, the function of Nazism in world history, is to destroy the past. And the Bolsheviks, who were going down the same route in Russia, when they triumphed, their object is now to go throughout the world and destroy this past. And they were even organized, as in the last days of Germany, some kind of wolf packs of youth who were to go out and destroy buildings. That is, the Germans destroying their own buildings, so the enemy would have nothing to. The past civilization would have no remnant left. Now we wonder what is beyond all this. If this is some kind of universal destruction, if old religion, if old art, culture, civilization is to be destroyed, and the very buildings of the past are to be destroyed, what is the revolutionary idea of the future? We see that there's some idea of changing man. Huxley says that the revolution will be against man himself. We'll look at two brief quotes from Nietzsche, whom we'll discuss in the next lecture as one of the chief prophets of this new age. He says two things which are most interesting from the point of view. One, he says in his book, The Will to Power, under certain circumstances, the appearance of the extremist form of pessimism, and actually nihilism, might be the sign of a process of incisiveness and most essential growth, and of mankind, transit into a completely new condition of existence, This is what I've understood. Again, when he speaks about this concept of the transvaluation of all values, he says, with this formula, a counter-movement finds expression in regard to both a principle and a mission, a movement in which some remote future will supersede this perfect nihilism, but which nevertheless regards it, nihilism, as a necessary step, both logically and psychologically, towards its own advent, and which positively cannot come about except on top of it and out of it. And we have a very interesting quote from Lenin, and he says, actually giving his ideal by the factory throughout the world, which no one can escape, but this factory discipline, which the proletariat will extend to the whole world of society after the defeat of the capitalist and overthrow the exploiters, is by no means our ideal, our final aim. It is but a foothold necessary for the radical cleansing of society of all the hideousness and foulness of capitalist exploitation, in order to advance further. And Lenin himself, for all his arguments against the anarchists, is finally forced to admit that the final goal of communism is exactly the same as the final goal of Bakunin, the anarchist, that is, some kind of absolute anarchy. In the next lecture, we'll go into exactly what this can mean. It does have a definite meaning in the theology of revolution. We'll finish with a brief quote from our poet of our century, W.B. Yeats, Irish poet who was very mixed up with occultism, who founded his own lodge of occultism, was very sympathetic at one time to Hitler because he seemed to be incarnating some new kind of occult principle. And in fact, Hitler himself proclaimed himself as the first dictator in a new age of magic. But you're going to use fascism to stop the occultism and criticize sorcery of the Kabbalists and the Masons and everybody that's been corrupted by the Jews. Yeats wrote, "Dear predatory birds, prepare for war. Love war because of its horror. That belief may be changed. Civilization renewed. Belief comes from shock. Belief is renewed continually in the ordeal of death." Let's skip ahead here. The people who make the revolutions ordinarily do not see this, that the thing is beyond. They all feel that in doing this, they are destroying the whole weight of civilization, of religion, of tradition. Once it is destroyed, and we see how it took a long time, from the time of the French Revolution when it began. All these revolutions are unsuccessful, obviously because there's too much weight from the past left, too much tradition left, too much culture and civilization is still left. There's only when they've destroyed everything, and even made some kind of new creature, some kind of person who is used to violence. And we see in the West, if you look, children look at the television. They see people get killed off every day. They get very callous towards violence, towards bloodshed. The same kind of thing is going on in the free world to make people used to bloodshed, violence, quite callous to it. We see this with all these wars televised, and now you're seeing people who choose to pump you full all day, every day on Twitter, whether it's the crimes of Hamas or the crimes of Israel. Dead kids and everything, all day long. People cheering for it. Once this kind of person is introduced, then there's going to become a new religious revelation. And even W.B. Yeats says this is still all positive. We saw how the neocons had this philosophy too, and how much out of the 19th century there was this call for a continual violence and war because it forces evolution. We should love this whole process of revolution and war and destruction because it means a new revolution is being born. And now we'll have to look into the next lecture. And this new religion all is bound up for the very idea of anarchy, the idea of overcoming nihilism, is the end of the revolution, which a very few astute people have seen into and have even spoken about. So that's a refutal of all this communism.